You know the song. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to laugh, a time to weep. At the synagogue where I grew up, this 1965 song by the Byrds was a regular staple at our High Holy Day services. So much so that in the years after our cantor left, and my friends and I had a chance to lead our very own teen service, this was one of the first songs that we wanted to reinsert into our service. Reflecting now with adult eyes, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why we sang it during the High Holy Days, or even when exactly during the holidays we sang it. Perhaps it was connected in some ways to Mourner's Kaddish. After all, we often read the original text behind these lyrics from Ecclesiastes at funerals. Or maybe it had something to do with the ways in which we reflect on our lives on Yom Kippur. Perhaps it was a nod to the next upcoming holiday of Sukkot. After all, our tradition assigns the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, to the holiday of Sukkot. Sukkot might seem like an odd time, though, to read this book. Sukkot is the holiday of the harvest, of preparing to pray for rain. Today, on Shmini Atzeret, is the day on which we traditionally switch from saying Morid Hatal, the one who brings down the dew, to Mashiv Haruach Morid Hagashem, the one who brings on the wind and causes rain to fall, in the Giverot prayer, all about God's might. Today is the day we start praying for rain. More broadly, one of Sukkot's names is Zman Simchatenu, the season of our joy. So how does Kohelet, which focuses so intensely on the seeming futility of life, fit into this holiday? The key is another important aspect of Sukkot, which is to say, Sukkot, the sukkah, a fragile, shaky, temporary hut in which we're supposed to dwell for a week, where we're able to see the stars through its roof, where we'll get thoroughly soaked if sitting in it while it's raining. It's a symbol of our fragility, a moment in which we are supposed to leave our solid, seismically retrofitted, temperature-controlled homes and go outside and sit in these temporary, fragile structures to remind us that our lives are indeed fragile and fleeting, that we too, like our Sukkot, are finite, fragile beings. In their wisdom, the rabbis picked just the right book. We've just finished the intense spiritual work of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We've taken account of our lives, and we have, and our choices, and made amends. We've asked and offered forgiveness, and are starting a new year with a clean slate. And now, when we're still a little spiritually vulnerable, we're told to really give thanks for what we have, for the abundance in our lives, and lest we get too haughty, reminded that none of it lasts forever. Kohelet, which could be translated as the gatherer or the preacher, called Ecclesiastes in English, from the Greek meaning member of the assembly, is described in the opening line as the son of King David. Jewish tradition ascribes these writings to the wisdom of King Solomon, though there's some scholarly debate about whether the likely timing of Kohelet's writing actually aligns with Solomon, or perhaps came much later and is inspired by Solomon. Either way, the opening verse sets the tone for the book, as Kohelet decries, Havel Havelim Amar Kohelet, Havel Havalim Hakol Havel. Utter futility, said Kohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. You can hear the repetition of Hevel over and over again, which is also connected to vapor. You can almost hear it in the word, Hevel. It could also mean senseless or absurdity. In other words, all is absurd. It's not exactly an uplifting introduction to a book, but it sets up the sense of deep realism and struggle with which Kohelet is about to embark. a deep sense of why are we here and what's the point of it all. Indeed, the next question Kohelet asks is the essential question of the book. What real value is there for a person in all the gains they make beneath the sun? Or in another translation, what profit is there for a person in all the amal, all the toil they perform beneath the sun? The rest of the book seeks answers to this question, although the conclusion Kohelet reaches is that ultimately there is no profit. We come into this world as we left it, unable to take any of it with us. But the key for Kohelet is to make the most out of every moment of living. This is where the beautiful balance the birds sing about come into play. As Kohelet says, a season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. Life can be full of beautiful contrasts, of joy and sorrow, of triumph and tragedy, of growth and withering. But the beauty lies in how we experience it, all of it, that we shouldn't take a second for granted. As one commentator points out, everything has its time. We do not understand or control the course of events, so the only reasonable approach is to enjoy life as it comes. As Kohelet says, thus I realize the only worthwhile thing there is for them is to enjoy themselves and do what is good in their lifetime. Today, as we also mark the one-year anniversary in the Hebrew calendar of the attacks of October 7th, on Simchat Torah just a year ago, we think about the ways our dancing and joy was transformed into mourning. This has been a difficult year, marked by tragedy upon tragedy. And of course, added to that, there are the other more personal tragedies of those in our own lives whom we lost in this past year, or the grief that we carry with us every day for those we lost in past years. The balance of which Kohelet speaks feels off-kilter, like the world has fallen too much on the side of war and weeping and breaking down, rather than peace and laughing and building up. Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai offered this meditation on Kohelet. A man in his life has no time to have time for everything. He has no room to have room for every desire. Ecclesiastes was wrong to claim that. A man has to hate and love all at once, with the same eyes to cry and to laugh, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, make love and war and love, and hate and forgive and remember and forget and order and confuse and eat and digest what long history does in so many years. A man in his life has no time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins forgetting. And his soul is knowing and very professional. Only his body remains an amateur, always. It tries and fumbles. He doesn't learn and gets confused, drunk and blind in his pleasures and pains. In autumn, he will die like a fig, shriveled, sweet, full of himself. The leaves dry out on the ground, and the naked branches point to the place where there is time for everything. Yes, life is fragile and fleeting, but, teaches Kohelet, that just means that we have to really live it. We have to squeeze every last drop out of the moments we have. How do we do that? Kohelet says we should wear our fancy clothes to the grocery store, drink a nice bottle of wine with fast food, sing the wrong words off-key at the top of our lungs, tell the people in our lives just how much we love them. Don't hold back our affections. Find moments of joy wherever we can. Life is fleeting and fragile, so pay attention. Make the most of this beautiful, broken life. We get this one chance to live.